When I first wrote a short abstract for this, I said I would talk about dispute, and I will talk about disputes, but perhaps in a somewhat more muted manner than I first thought. I have to begin with a sort of confiteor, that is to say that I am not, and I do not regard myself in the long term as a sort of native title anthropologist. I've had a longer career than that. I did a lot of my early work of this kind with land claims, and I became involved with native title matters, mostly in communities and places that I have known for some time, including some decades. And that was the way that I preferred to do it. Since then, I have become involved in a few native title matters in places that I didn't previously know, and it's been very interesting and very eye-opening. But my general preference has been to do things like that where I know the landscape and the people. And I would say that from that perspective, I have become aware of what I talked about in my abstract, that is, native title as a new arena into which disputes are projected. And the disputes themselves being generally, in my experience, a very long-standing and very sedimented and constantly acted and reenacted over long periods of time. So that's the sort of position that I'm coming from. I also, in thinking more about this, have asked myself the question, how many of these disputes are mediatable and how? And so that's the last part of my talk I hope to come to. That is, what have we learned? What sorts of things provoke and continue disputes? And what, if anything, can we do or say about it? There's another theme that sort of emerged in my thinking about this whole topic. That is, I see towns as places of especial challenge for claims of connection, directly relevant to the native title issues. Towns are places of disrupted connection, in my experience. And so what I want to do through the paper is come to 2 or 3 examples of this, and then leave you to reflect on that question, whether you know towns and what circumstances you've seen there, and the way in which they are perhaps drivers of disconnection, of disrupted connection. That all comes from my long-term experience. I've done most of my longest-term research around a town in the Northern Territory, Catherine. And so that experience has led me to wonder about what are the longer-term drivers that provoke disruption, and what might we do or say about it. I want to be clear that most of the examples I will give you of towns and disrupted connection come from northern and more remote Australia. There is the issue of other regions, other kinds of places, and I would invite your comment at the end, because it may be that I am looking at a number of towns that were developed during a particular social and historical period, and they all have certain kinds of commonalities. There may be other regions where we want to develop a different sort of comparative perspective. So I'll leave you to comment on that, and I hope you will. It seems to me that in the earlier days of native title and of land claims too, contention tended to be greatest between indigenous people and government. So I'll just give you a very rapid look at some of the places where that was the case, and also where contention and disputation was not a very important part of the processes as they develop. So let me first turn to my first talk about this very briefly. Wanjinawungurwillingim, a large claim area in Western Australia, where it so happens my husband was one of the anthropologists dealing with that. Now, if you look at that area, you will see that it was that there were claims, native title claims that proceeded over the area in stages, but once the first stage involving Aryan people had been heard, basically the rest of it was much easier. And you will see that it's a very large area where there isn't a town, right? There were stations in this area, but no town. The biggest town that you can see there is on the extreme right, and that was Wyndham, which is, you might say, just at the fringe of this area. Now, it's not that Wyndham did not play a role in the region; it did. And here's a picture showing various prisoners being brought to Wyndham in the early period. Many of them drawn from that southern area. Okay, but that proceeded quite rapidly once the first anthropological material had been heard. Now, the Cape York consent determinations of 2004, 2009, 2012, and so on, it seems to me also proceeded quite rapidly and on the basis of anthropological reports. Sorry, that's a picture of how intricate the clan country picture is of that Norwegian and Merlan area. Okay. I haven't got a map here of Cape York, but there is the large tip of the Cape area where there were no towns. Of course, there were towns further down the Cape, but that set of consent determinations could proceed quite rapidly over the northern part of the Cape. And now, so these were claims that took place in, let's call it, some of the most remote parts of the continent where towns did not develop. A main general point that I make about towns is that in the recent period and in the context of native title claims in towns, there has come to be much more argumentation among indigenous groups and not so much with other outside parties like, of course, there's still contention with governments and so on, but there has developed much more contention among indigenous groups involved in the claim. So we see there a consequence of towns being, in some senses, drivers of disrupted connection. So how can we view that? The reasons are both historical, sometimes traceable to earlier conditions, including ones of early colonization, and to the ongoing consequences and social and historical developments of that. Take Catherine. Their native title case has been in preparation and ongoing since 1998. Now, as I realized, thinking about it, I can't tell you much about in detail about this case because it remains unresolved. But I think I can use it to illustrate more general points that I want to make. Towns grew as points of settler concentration. In many places like Catherine, the concentration was driven on the one hand by pastoral settlement and on the other hand, further to the north by mining. Cattle were brought into the area of roughly present Catherine Town in the 1880s. The first cattle station, Springvale, began there in 1878. As a direct result of pastoralism in the immediate Catherine area and mining to the north of it, there was great decimation of local populations and those with any demonstrable ancestral connections back to the time of putative sovereignty, which is around 1880 in this area. But there do remain some people who can claim connection since effective sovereignty, and that's because with the establishment of cattle stations, there was some disruption, but the only recourse that some of the survivors had is to come into those stations, and some of those people are ones who can trace their ancestry back to the time of effective sovereignty in the Catherine area. Let me consider the historical period a little bit further. In relation to this venerable gentleman. Well, in Catherine, the first and principal pastoralist in the immediate area and the establisher of Springvale was this man, Alfred Giles, who also made himself the justice of the peace. He was the early trialer of sheep pasturage, and he also had cattle. In the attempt to introduce herds, he was involved in subduing people mainly to the south and west of what is now Catherine Town. There was an immediate conflict of interest, as you may be able to see, inherent in the roles that he took on as pastoralist and justice of the peace. He happened to have kept a fairly detailed diary of his activities, but in those diaries, there are lots of telling silences about what happened and so on once Aboriginal cattle spearing was detected and so on. So I think we can read those silences with a fairly sophisticated way. Now, aside from people like Alfred Giles, there was gold mining on a creek north and east of the town, which was also very unregulated. These gold fields were about 5 decades before the last so-called gold rush at Tennant Creek, which is, of course, further to the south, about 1930. So my main point about this is that there was population destruction in the area of these developing towns, like Catherine. There remain a few people who can demonstrate long-term connection to the area. That's because they participated in this process of being hassled, harassed, killed, etc., in the development of cattle stations, but then coming back in and finding their sole point of protection in being around those cattle stations. Now, that's the story, and I'll come back to it again, of one town. This contrasts with some other towns, like Alice Springs. I don't want to dwell on that because that's not an area I know as well. But I would say that there were some mitigating circumstances in Alice Springs. We have a fairly large Aboriginal presence and recognition of Aboriginal entitlement in Alice Springs that had never been the case in a town like Catherine. Why is that? Well, I think that there was an early period in the 1870s and 1880s when there was a lot of that early destruction, the Barrow Creek Massacre, and other things. But change can be gauged by the period at which Frank Gillen, for example, took over as telegraph station manager in 1891. He became basically administrator of Central Australia. He became the sub-protector of Aboriginal people. There was a process of getting rid of a highly disruptive police force, which was led by Wilshire, a notorious policeman. An Aboriginal reserve was created around the telegraph station where people were fed and got rations. There was also the very important factor of the Fink River mission pastors of Hermannsburg, who were a constraining and conserving institutional force near Alice Springs. So all these kinds of influences, including mission influence and moderating reserve formation, were entirely lacking in the Catherine area. There were no missions there, and there was very little constraint on people like Alfred Giles in the early period. So I just want to introduce that as a bit of a contrast to the Catherine town. Now I'll come back to Catherine. I should have been showing you some of these pictures, the Hermannsburg mission, which you know, Constable Wilshire, who's very notorious. I imagine you've all read something about him. Now, here's an NT location map showing you the couple of towns I've been talking about or want to talk about. The writing's a bit small, but maybe you can see Catherine there and Pine Creek. And I will talk about both of those again. Now, there was this space in Catherine opened up by colonial occupation of two kinds, the cattle stations on the one hand, the mining activities to the north. Into that space, there came and have come over decades indigenous people from further afield. This process has occurred in stages. It's still ongoing, and it was very much affected over time by the contemporary political economy, the regulations, and the management by people and institutions of Aboriginal people. So in the growth of Catherine, besides the developments of communications, hotels, and generally a town service center on the pastoral fringe, a tin mine some 60 kilometers away to the east of that developing town grew from the early 20th century. And this was Marranboy, which perhaps you could see there. just, which was an entrepot for arrivals of people from southern Arnhem Land. Now, hundreds of Aborigines from southern Arnhem Land occupied this area from the early 20th century until the 1950s and into the formation period of post-war settlements. A reserve was declared at Baranboy. The administrators were very keen to keep the some 1,200 Aborigines who were camped around that mine site from coming into Catherine and going to other cities and towns. So there were declared these boundaries with the purposes of management and containment. Miners on the field continued to employ some Aborigines into the 1940s. Post-war, settlements were formed of early Bambili, which is now Warunga or Warunga, as people say incorrectly. And again, there was this large effort to keep Aborigines from going into towns and cities. There's been continuing slow movement of those settlement populations into and around Catherine Town over the succeeding decades, with families from further afield establishing beachheads in town for purposes of schooling, medical visits, jobs, and other reasons. So there is this situation there, a small number of people who can trace ancestry to the approximate time of effective sovereignty, and a larger and more mixed number of people who came in largely post-World War II when the administrative regulations loosened up a bit. Now here's a relevant point to native title. There was great loss of connection to the original areas from which those people from Arnhem Land came. In other words, a lot of them came in from the river systems in central Arnhem Land, and over time lost connection or effective connection to the areas from which they come as they migrated into Baranboy and settlement areas. So this is just a map stolen from our old friend Ronald Byrne. But anyway, it shows you just on the right-hand side this sort of Arnhem area from which some of those people came. Okay. So this large in-migration of, let's call them generally southern and central Arnhem Landers into Baranboy, and then subsequently further into the town area, which is still ongoing, as I say, today. There was also significant effect over a long period of time, over decades, on the rise of a part Aboriginal population from mixing with railroad workers, miners around the town, and works camps. Now, a lot of those people in the earlier decades of the 20th century tended to be moved to institutions, to Darwin for work, and so on. Some people of Indigenous descent of this sort have subsequently sought to reconnect with other people at Catherine, often with only small clues or somewhat vague ideas of their provenience and groups of origin. So there has tended to be a much more generic and kind of floating use of language group names and so on, as people use those to try to connect with relatives in the Catherine area. Many people of those who have been taken away and those who have gone away have had a difficulty finding people and families and groups of origin. Now, there is some contrast with, here's a Catherine Town map before I pass on to Pine Creek, and I just want to show you, you see the Stewart Highway passing right through the town. Well, one thing that's important about that is that right next to it, there is a railway track. And for many decades, well into the 20th century, to Aboriginal people, that railway track was a notional divider. Okay, so they readapted the sort of railway line to the idea of people who came in from the north who should not, go beyond that line, and who should remain on the northern side of it in residence and in their daily activities, and people from further south and from the town and from the west who could go up to that railway line. That remained a kind of notional dividing line for a long time, and then began to be eroded as the complexity of town camp development and so on happened in Catherine. Now, there is some contrast with Pine Creek in some of the historical processes at work. Pine Creek is to the north, 90 kilometers from Catherine. It's a much smaller town. It also, as you can see, has a railway line which runs through it. And interestingly, over time, indigenous people also adapted that railway line as the notional boundary between Arnhem-Landers who came in from one side and Daly River people who came in from the other side. So that has served as an effective notional boundary and continues to do so from this step to this day, as you will see. Now, Pine Creek, like Catherine, was the center of some works on the overland telegraph from the 1870s. And then there was a mining boom from the 1880s and a very large influx of Chinese miners. First came coolies who had come from Singapore and Malaysia, and they were followed by Chinese diggers from Hong Kong who poured onto the gold fields. By the mid-1880s, there were over 2,000 Chinese in Pine Creek. There was very large-scale decimation of local indigenous peoples to the point that nobody remains who can claim ancestral connection to the time of contact population roots of Pine Creek. I think that has a lesson for us about the idea that there is never, sort of complete eradication. I think in some of these contexts there was. Over time, though, there came in this influx of other people from outlying areas, just as happened in Catherine. There were groups that came in from the Daly Riverside, as I said, known as generally as Wagiman, and there were people who came in from nearer and further Arnhem Land. Differences then with Catherine include the fact that there have long been no indigenous people who can claim ancestral connection to the Pine Creek area per se. There's been a quite great and complete decimation of the original population. But social relations between Aboriginal groups coming into the town have developed gradually over decades with a number of intermarriages that occurred quite early and interactions of key Indigenous personalities with resident non-Indigenous people as well. And these have tended to be positive, relatively positive. So, Wagiman, Pine Creek has been an eastern yet centrally located focus, providing access to their lands on the Daly River and a wet season retreat from the heavy rains and so on the river systems. For the Jawoyn, so-called Jawoyn and Miley people who come into Pine Creek from the northern and eastern side, Pine Creek remains a highly strategic point. It remains a point of access to some of the cattle stations on which they used to work, to some important parts of their own country, and so on. Now, recently, I just want to show you a couple of things as we go on more about the Pine Creek camps. In Pine Creek, consent determination of 2019 has seen the Wagiman on the one hand and the Jawoyn on the other deemed native title holders in Pine Creek. So this was a consent determination. It did not, therefore, have all the stringencies of a litigated decision. And as I said before, effectively, the railway line served as the kind of boundary that people used to imagine and to talk about the situation. Now, what sort of post-frontier consensus developed in Pine Creek? What enabled the situation to reach that kind of friendly consent determination? From the time I first knew Pine Creek in the 1970s, there was an understood division of the town into roughly this north, south, east, west line along the railway line. The division, however, was somewhat notional and prescriptive and didn't actually reflect completely the social situation. In fact, the population of all the camps in Pine Creek was somewhat more mixed than that notional use of the dividing line. So if here you see there's a thing called the town camp. Take notice of that, which is on the north and eastern side of the railway line. And there's a thing called Kybrook Farm, to the south. All right. If we look at the camp populations, we discover, and this comes from a work by Jackie Wolf of 1987 on Pine Creek camps, which was oriented to housing questions. Okay, if you look at that, you see that there are said to be 8 Wagiman, the preponderance of Wagiman at Highwood Farm, that one to the south, and there is said to be a preponderance of Miley people, North Arnhem Landers, in the town and town camp. But you notice that the division is by no means, absolute. And in fact, there were some early and important marriages that were made across the Daly River Miley Jowan line. It is evident from Jackie Wolf's material again that in 1987, about 1/3 of the adults in Pine Creek, there were then about 100 Aboriginal people in Pine Creek, that in 1987, about 1/3 of adults had grown up on cattle stations outside of Pine Creek elsewhere, and that they were also not transients in Pine Creek, that they came there recurrently. Despite the fact that some said their father or mother or both had been born in Pine Creek, however, only 3 respondents who were surveyed by Jackie Wolf gave Pine Creek as their country. There were hardly any people in Pine Creek who regarded that as their country of origin. Pine Creek was the place most often mentioned by respondents as to where their parents had been born. This suggests that people interviewed have been making Pine Creek their place of residence, recurrent residence, for around 20 to 30 years. Wolf observes that adults knew and spoke about their countries of origin and maintained attachments to their countries of origin. In 1987, as I said, though, only 3 said that Pine Creek was their country. I think there's a diagrammatic representation from the Wolf book on Pine Creek, which shows us something. It shows where people had lived, their associations with cattle stations, towns, and institutions elsewhere. And it also shows the central and pivotal role of Pine Creek in their movements related to work, family, and weather conditions. So I like this, it gives you a kind of more dynamic picture of what Pine Creek was about and where people came from, where they lived. Also, in the factors in Pine Creek, there was recognized Aboriginal leadership on both notional sides, on the Daly River side and on the Arnhem side of the notional railway line. There was some intermarriage, as I already said. There was an iconic, when I first knew Pine Creek, there was an iconic and revered Wagiman couple who were regarded in Pine Creek as kind of founders of one of the residential camps in Pine Creek, and they eventually wound up living there permanently. So this consent determination, which was reached in 2019, had a number of social factors operating. Another strongly stabilizing factor, in my opinion, has been that most of the Pine Creek residents are and have remained camp residents with a similar outlook, a similar level of education, roughly on the same sort of social level and interacting with each other. There have been a couple of exceptions to that, people who have been taken away. For example, one woman who was taken away has come back and has a very different formation to many of her immediate and close relatives, and there have been a couple of other people of that kind as well. And they have, in some ways, been drivers of contention within the 2 camps that they occupy. Another stabilizing factor, I would say, in Pine Creek has been the smaller scale and mostly mining occupation of the white population, especially in recent decades. Early contact violence, which, as I said, was quite complete, gave way to considerable levels of interaction and mutual knowledge of Indigenous and non-Indigenous people around the town with workers and local residents. Certain Aboriginal families worked for For example, the local butcher, they became strongly associated with particular non-Indigenous families. Some of these people also maintained relations with outlying stations and station managers. Some key, especially prominent men of both groups, Wagiman and the Arnhem groups, were liked and respected in Pine Creek, not only in their own camps, but also by non-Indigenous locals, to the point that two of these prominent men, as adults, were tutored in literacy, as I saw, for some time by a local woman who was prominent in the non-Indigenous community. They expressed a desire to become literate, and she was a regular tutor to them. There was also a local general store run by a Chinese family, which dealt on relatively friendly terms with Aboriginal customers and knew them well. Okay, so there have been quite a number of these factors which I've tried to roughly outline, which I think has led away from that picture of early decimation, complete destruction of the Aboriginal population, into a stabilizing and a more consensual situation as between the two groups that came in from both sides. Now, I'll give you a final town example of Halls Creek, which is a town I've only visited, I don't know well, but the township of Halls Creek has the element, I would say, of colonial depopulation of the original town area. There was an early old Halls Creek, and you could see it there where the 3 is approximately. And then the Halls Creek Township was moved about 15 kilometers away to a new town site. Quite early, the station of Mullabula was established close to the new township and became the largest Indigenous population in Western Australia. Now, relying on some conversations and discussions I had a few years back with my friend and colleague, Pat McConville, Pat analyzed the ethno-linguistic data pertaining to traditional language identities in this area. The Halls Creek Township was established in around 1880, which is the same time period that I'm talking about with Pine Creek and Catherine, and the nearby goldfields were established in the mid-1880s. The Mullabula Mission was established in 1910. McConville, making use of Phyllis Caberry's foundational work in this area, sees the original Halls Creek area as having been associated with Gija language, but as complicated and moved and blurred by the movement of Jaru-speaking population into the area following the demographic loss of speakers in the old Halls Creek Gija area. McConville points out that the earliest ethnography, which comes from 1897, identified a Gija dialect, Walgi, as having been spoken in the old Halls Creek area, which McConville also concludes was the Indigenous language of Halls Creek. McConville suggests that the early contact period, circa 1885, that the population displacements wrought by the very sudden and violent influx of settlers and gold prospectors may have led to this displacement of Gija Walgi speakers and to mainly Jaru-speaking people filling that territorial space. So again, we have this phenomenon of people coming in to fill a space. Phyllis Caberry had also noted that the original township of Old Halls Creek served as a major meeting point for Aboriginal people hailing from country both to the north and south of the township. So I won't say any more. There's more information, and I'm sure that there has been more information collected in the context of native title work, which has been done around Halls Creek, which I am not privy to. But I point your attention to the conclusion that was drawn by both from the Caberry material and later work, that there was an original population in Halls Creek which was displaced. So what does all this point to, talking about towns as zones of disrupted connection? Well, I think, first of all, the material points to understanding which comes from deepening and historical dimension to native title. We deal with the consequences, I think, of the longer historical period regularly, but it is not strongly reflected in methodological writing about native title. And I refer to some of the iconic works like Peter Sutton's book, for example, on native title, which tends more or less to talk about native title as though we were dealing with classical social systems, which clearly in these contexts we are not. We are dealing with various aspects of often quite dramatic change which has occurred. In most of these town situations that I've been talking about, we find the results of disrupted connection and contention. In the Catherine case, we find the interesting business that a whole lot of people came down from Arnhem Land, came south, and distributed themselves around interim non-Indigenous settlements like mine sites and remained there. It reestablished some forms of connection to the area to which they had moved, for example, to Maranboy, and also basically lost most aspects of connection to the areas from which they had come in Arnhem Land. So we have a kind of staged movement. And as I say, if you want to look at it in the long term, you have to realize that that movement is still going on. People are still coming out of those more northern areas towards towns and cities, but now not only Catherine, of course, but also Darwin and elsewhere. So what are some of the effects of these kinds of town developments? And as I said, this is a regionally somewhat specific set of cases that I've given you, but I think I've already pointed to some of the effects. First of all, there is weakened connection to the immediate town area, and often, as in Catherine, to the areas from which some people have come. And the forms of connection that I think are relevant to native title, it seems to me, being objective, become much more generic than they are in areas where people have had continuous and intimate connection with country. For example, you can begin to get the generic forms of people all saying, well, we water the heads of strangers, we introduce strangers to the country, we believe that the spirits of the old people are in the country, and so on. Now, it's not that that is in any sense fabricated or concocted or anything like that, but just that it tends to be a much more generic sort of set of criteria and practices relating to attachment to country than one encounters where people have had a long and continuous relationship to country. There's also in all these town situations a big element of people who went away or were taken away often, given the earlier administrations, from the area in question. And they then sometimes nowadays wish reintegration into those social systems around the towns. Now, that reintegration can be difficult, and probably many of you have had the experience that I've had of being contacted by people saying, can I have this and that bit of information? Can you help me to find so-and-so and try to find my way back to the people that I came from? Now, that, of course, is something that one attempts to do, but it can also be quite difficult to do. And it has to be said that there is a very strong association of that phenomenon of being taken away or going away or being sent away for education with racial factors. So it is very strongly part Aboriginal, people of part Aboriginal descent who have thus been removed and who are then seeking a reintegration. And that can also present various areas of difficulty, as not only for finding their way back, but also as for the relations between them and other people on the ground. So I don't think that aspect of the difference can be dismissed. It is important to people. And also, there goes with that whole phenomenon of having been taken away, there goes with that a whole phenomenon of cultural difference, which has been inculcated and which those people taken away have adopted as their existential mode of being. And often that is not compatible with the way of being, the mode of being of people who have remained in place and not been taken away. So again, that sounds like something that's difficult. It is difficult. It is not something, however, that can be dismissed. In one case, non-Catherine, that I've worked on, there's been the phenomenon of a whole set of people who did not know what their connection was to a particular area, who have found that by a very long and circuitous process, and who then wish to be reintegrated in the name of a particular clan into that region. That has presented difficulties, and among those difficulties are the fact that in terms of their social and cultural formation, they are very different from the people who have remained in the area. And there is a certain gap of understanding and a certain gap of sympathy between those groups. So that's another phenomenon that I think we regularly have to deal with. The long and the short of it is, for native title, I think that the areas where towns, I'll return to the town feature, the areas where towns have developed tend to become areas that are less storied, that are less replete with the kinds of indigenous forms of connection that we can know from other areas. Again, it's not that people can't present these as forms of connection, but they tend to be somewhat more generalized, and they often tend to be contested by other people. There is also this phenomenon that I've mentioned, that in the returning populations, in the people who come back, there is often this sort of element of biculturalism, which means that there is a considerable difference between people on the ground and the people who have come back. And in my experience, again, it is often some of those people who have the much greater bicultural expertise who tend to find themselves either taking on or being pushed into taking on sort of spokespeople's role, and being the people who speak up in meetings and things like that, and thus taking on some of the burdens of that kind of leadership, but also finding themselves to some extent being seen as overreaching in the local context and being disliked for that. So that's another phenomenon, and I've recently had to write a report which is exactly about that kind of thing going on. Now, to return briefly to my discussion of Pine Creek, where, interestingly, and given the early destruction that I talked about, there has been subsequent recalibration of that social situation. There have been people who've come in from either side. They've long said, and their elders said, that they were not from there, right? But that has also meant that there had not been in that older generation any contention about the originary status of those groups there. They knew they came from the Daly River. They knew that they had come from other parts of the country. But there was the establishment of new forms of connection between those groups and, to some extent, to the non-Indigenous population in Pine Creek, which I think was an interesting phenomenon and a feature of the small scale, perhaps, of that town setting. And there have also been these sort of stabilizing founder couples in the Aboriginal population of Pine Creek. Most of those founding couples, so-called, as I call them, are now deceased, but I think they had a very significant impact on the development of social relations across camps in Pine Creek. I think I must leave it here. I'm very waiting for this.